I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is wildlife biologist and former instructor at the Maritime College of Forest Technology, Rod Cumberland. Rod is actually suing the college for wrongful dismissal, and he's here to talk with us today about that. Thank you for being here today, Rod.
My pleasure, Vicki.
So, you are arguing that it is your stance on glyphosate spraying, glyphosate the herbicide, that led to your dismissal. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and just set the backstory for everyone?
Well, that's
loaded question.
Yeah, that's a deep topic. But essentially, I mean, in my dismissal letter, that is one of the 8 points in it, is that I undermined the science of a vegetation management seminar, which is glyphosate spraying. So, you know, that they're arguing that has nothing to do with it is kind of mind-boggling, because that is one of their 8 reasons. All the other reasons, you know, that I looked at the time, and I didn't hear about them till the day I was fired, but nonetheless, I knew what I had done at the college. I knew, you know, my history there, and when they were mentioning things that where you're following policy, you know, we had a policy on when you arrive at class, we had a policy no hats in class, you know. When you throw those things into your list of reasons, it gets, you know, again, I'm going to court for a reason.
So there was a conference, though, that you talked about.
Oh yes, yeah. There's you're right, and what that's referring to, and some people may know about it, but there's they have and they call it now, to get away from the herbicide spraying and glyphosate, they've now termed it vegetation management. So it's a lot friendlier term for people to understand. It kind of gets away from all the negative connotations around spraying and glyphosate. But nonetheless, they had these, when I started speaking out against it, part of the plan, and we know that there was a plan because Miles Howe, who was an investigative reporter with the Halifax Media Co-op, he did a right to information with the Department of Natural Resources, and he got a pile of internal documents from DNR, and all you have to do is Google the Cumberland files or Halifax Media Co-op, glyphosate, whatever, and they'll come up. And he did 2 big articles on all those emails and how the industry and DNR were all colluding on how do we shut Rod up and who do we get to counter what he's saying. So, you know, they grabbed Dr. Lautenschlager at first, and then of course we had a big debate on CBC, and you can Google that. You can Google Cumberland Lautenschlager CBC and hear how that debate went. It didn't go very well for the doctor, and so all of a sudden they needed someone else to shut Rod up. So, you know, so I mean, I knew that was, you know, they were always, you know, trying. There was a very deliberate attempt to try to give the alternate story, or, you know, their version of the story. So, you know, that wasn't surprising. So to me, that.
For people who don't know, what is your stance on glyphosate? And I know as a deer biologist, you studied it from a very specific angle too.
Yeah, again, you don't wake up one morning and say, I'd like to become public enemy #1 to the forest industry. You know, and actually, and I always try to say that to people, like, I have nothing against the forest industry. My dad was a blue-collar diesel mechanic for a GP for 30-some years, you know, and I work in the woods. It's not about shutting down or stopping the forest industry. And even if we stopped using glyphosate, the industry is not going to stop. I mean, Quebec banned it back in 2001, and the industry is still going. So it's not about shutting the industry. It's really about, you know, how much more money can we make? It's really the bottom line. But nonetheless, I was just doing my job as a deer biologist, setting antlerless quotas and doing what I did. And, you know, we had a lot of habitat set aside for deer yards, almost 300,000 hectares set aside for deer yards in the province, and a lot of them were vacant. So, which begged the question to me as a deer guy, you know, like, why are these deer yards vacant? And of course, the forest industry wanted, you know, back in 2012, 2013, 2014, they were after more of the conservation forest, so they could, even though they claimed that they were managing sustainably. Well, if you're managing sustainably, you should have lots of wood out there if you're doing it sustainably, but of course they were running out of wood, which begs the question, how sustainable was what you were doing? And now they wanted all these extra deer yards, and of course that was where we drew the battle lines. You have to pick the hill you're going to die on, and that was the hill I picked to die on. You're not going to get the deer yards, because we were saving them for the low in the wood supply. So anyways, what actually piqued me to this whole glyphosate thing was a call from a guy in Charlotte County, Ernie Hatt from St. George, and they had a camp out in the macadamia and said, why is there no deer around our camps? So I went to our habitat guys and said, listen, what's there for habitat around the macadamia? And they got their maps out and laid them all out. There was 40 some cuts out there. They said, my goodness, there's all kinds of harvesting in the area. There should be tons of deer food. So, and again, rather than taking them at their word, I thought, well, I'm going to go take a look. Because if there's no deer out there, and this guy's right, what's the reason? So another colleague of mine and I skidooed all those areas that winter. We went to every single one of the cuts. And when we got done, we analyzed all the data and said, what's growing there? Well, almost 70% of what was harvested was in plantation. So when they plant little green trees, they spray the area because hardwoods compete so well with softwood trees, right? And it's something we call in the forestry world tree silvics. So that explains like what the tree is, how it grows, and why it does what it does. So we know that early successional species, which are your poplars, your birches, your maples, they grow really quickly on a site because they're what we call shade intolerant. They can't grow in the shade. So their strategy to survive is to grow really quickly and take over the sunlight. Species like spruce and fir, they're what we call shade tolerant. So they can grow under the shade, which they always do. They grow a lot slower, but they will eventually take over the site. But they grow a lot differently. So, and of course the forest industry through the research realized if we get rid of the hardwood trees that are competing for all these site resources for the water and the minerals and everything else, our seedlings will grow a lot faster. So they'll make a lot more, put a lot more wood on and be available to harvest a lot quicker. So of course the industry is all about removing those hardwood trees. So in these areas, these plantations, they've actually sprayed them, and they spray them with glyphosate. And they use glyphosate, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but they sprayed with glyphosate because glyphosate works so well. And I've always made that point. The forestry research shows very clearly that glyphosate kills hardwoods really well. That's why they use it. Mm-hmm. And I don't blame them. If I was in that business, I would use it too, because guess what? It works really well if that's your goal. Of course, that's not what I'm into. I'm a deer guy. So when the question really becomes, if glyphosate kills hardwoods really well, and we know that, there's a ton of research that shows it works really well and it's cost effective. So the question is, if we know it kills hardwoods, then what impact does removing those hardwoods have on the critters that need them? Mm-hmm. And that's where I came in, because I was managing for the deer herd and trying to grow the deer herd for the hunters. We had a goal of 200,000 animals in the province. We were wherever we were at that point, and the deer herd, we shut the antlerless permits down for 8 years, and the herd took off and started growing, but where the herd was growing was not where I expected it to grow. Mm-hmm. I know I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to hunters and people that are in the woods all the time, because back in the day, you'd go to what we call choppings or clear cuts. That's because there was so much of this hardwood growth there, the deer were there eating it. And so when you start removing that, how much do you remove before it starts having an impact on deer? Because we always credited these cut areas with the profuse increase in deer food to the herd growing. So it boggles my mind that now all of a sudden the deer herd is declining, and we're not going to look at the component of their habitat that's food-based. It made no sense to me. I thought, well, of course, it's got to have some kind of influence. It caused the whole increase. Why would it not be causing the decline? So where the deer were growing was in and around urban areas, and we know that here in Charlotte County very well. But there, again, our deer yards were becoming vacant. So there seemed to be this change where there was on crown land, the deer herd was going down, and on agricultural areas and private ground and in urban areas, the deer herd were growing. And the number of nuisance calls I got during that time went through the roof, and I thought, something's going on. Like, why aren't the deer growing where we'd expect them to grow? So of course, again, I went up north and looked at what was going on in the deer yards up north, and I get the same numbers. 70% of the harvested areas around this one deer yard out in Tittagush was plantation. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's amazing that the same numbers I saw up there is the same. And I'm not saying it's like that all across the province, but in certain pockets, yeah, there's a real change happening. So then I had to get down to, okay, we need to put this in deer terms. What does this mean to a deer? So that we spray about 15,000 hectares a year, which is a little over 32,000 acres. And 1 acre of ground, when it's growing hardwoods, those profuse stump sprouts and stuff, can produce a ton of deer food. So we're removing 32,000 tons of deer food from crown land every single year. So the question is, if you remove 32,000 tons of deer food. Will that have an impact on the deer? As a deer biologist, I say, yes, it does. And we've seen that so clearly. So again, when I saw that, I realized, this is really the big issue. And there's areas like over around Coles Island where we used to harvest a ton of deer. Charlotte County is a perfect example because we used to harvest 4,000 deer in Charlotte County alone. And back in the whenever it was in the early 2000s, all of a sudden we're harvesting 4,000 deer in the entire province. So that's really the question is, okay, there's something going on in our deer herd. And then when you start, I actually brought this to show you, but if you start comparing New Brunswick to Maine and Quebec, so this is New Brunswick. This was 30 years ago when at our peak in New Brunswick, we harvested 30,000 deer. In 2015, we harvested a tenth of that. In Maine, 30 years ago, they harvested 30,000 deer, a little 25,000, I guess. And then in 2015, they harvested almost the same number of deer in Maine. Province of Quebec, their numbers jumped dramatically. And of course, Quebec banned glyphosate spraying in 2001. So when you start seeing stuff like that with areas that are very close to us, and the excuses that were given was, oh, it's coyotes in winters. Yeah. And I knew that was bogus because I'm seeing a difference on land ownership. And of course, coyotes roam the area. The coyotes don't just walk up to Crown Land and say, oh, we can't go there, it's Crown Land. Coyotes go wherever they go to find food. And same as winters. Winters blow in and do what they do wherever, those two factors give no credence to land ownership. So to suggest that those are the cause of why we see deer where we do is really ridiculous if you think about it. And same thing with Maine and Quebec. They both have severe winters. They both have lots of coyotes. So why are their numbers so different? There's got to be some other factor. And again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one out. But again, I did a lot of digging, and of course I found out what I did, and I started saying what I was saying, that glyphosate spraying that kills hardwoods has an impact. And I'm not saying it's the be-all and end-all, but it has to have an impact. And when they said it doesn't, it's great for deer, I was like, I'm not sure where you're getting your data, but.
Well, it is interesting to see Quebec, a neighboring province at that, with over 20 years of it being banned, to see that data. Do you know why they banned it? What was the reason?
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting because in Quebec, what happened in Quebec has never happened in New Brunswick. And in Quebec, they went to their researchers and they said, listen, we want you to look into this and tell us what the story is on, should we be using this or not? And they also opened it up to public comment. We want to know what the public thinks, should we do this? So the process Quebec went through was actually what I think is a very healthy process. We've never been exposed to this kind of process in New Brunswick or on this issue specifically. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of scientists that came forward and said, this was back in 2001, so this is 20-some years ago. And even then, they knew the research showed there was problems with glyphosate spraying. The public had a lot of concerns from an environmental perspective, also from health perspectives, and they made the decision, we're going to do forestry without it. And they've done quite well, and they've learned a lot. So, to bring those guys here, I think, is a smart move because they can help us, when the time comes to say, how else are we going to do this?
Why is there as a journalist, I find it a really hard topic to cover because when you're looking for information, I even look at how Health Canada was relying on some studies done by Monsanto, which is obviously the maker of Roundup. So a study done by the maker of Roundup wouldn't be the one to justify use in Canada. That should be your primary source. But there isn't a lot out there in terms of information. It's very hard to know how to piece it all together to really get investigative journalism done properly.
Yeah, I would say there's a ton of information out there. It's where you go for it, right? I mean, there's the Monsanto papers. I mean, when they did the lawsuits in the United States the last few years, people that have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it was tracked directly to their use of glyphosate and the spray, and they took Monsanto to court. And of course, through that process, they uncovered, which is similar to us, we've uncovered a few documents as well, but through that process in the States, they uncovered a lot of what they call now the Monsanto papers. And again, if people would take the time to Google the Monsanto papers, you can go there and read the thousands of papers of incriminating evidence of how Monsanto knew it was problematic and covered it up. So, and I knew this. I mean, I knew that even with another researcher, Tyrone Hayes, he he looked at a different type of atrazine is what he looked at, and its effect on frogs. And he, was doing his research, and all of a sudden found out that atrazine was causing issues with frogs in their reproductive cells. And he published his research, and all of a sudden they went at Tyrone Hayes, and next thing you know, he's unemployed, and they're questioning him and calling, unprofessional, and basically trying to ruin his career. Sounds familiar. And same as Eric Cirolini. Eric Cirolini, and he was working for Monsanto testing glyphosate in France. Mm-hmm. Same thing, and he did the same 30-day trial. Like most of the studies they do for the industry are short term and look at acute toxicity. So over the 30 days, they didn't see any dramatic mortality. So all of a sudden the conclusion is they're fine. Well, Eric Cirolini kept his rats alive for about 1.5 years, as long as they would stay alive, because they got wicked cancerous growths and they started dying. And Eric Cirolini published that paper, and then they had a concerted effort to get rid of Eric Cirolini. And you can follow it's amazing what they've done. Like a previous researcher from Monsanto winds up on the board of the journal that he published in. They pull the paper back, which is something that seldom happens, and all of a sudden you see this happening in the scientific literature, and you wonder, what's going on? Mm-hmm. Like it's, and you think, well, that won't happen in Canada or in New Brunswick, but then I was at a moose conference when I was employed with the college in 2016. So we were out in Brandon, Manitoba, and there was researchers there from the University of British Columbia, or Northern BC, UBC, and they were doing research on where do moose go, what causes moose to use the habitats that they do, because mm-hmm. where all the mountain pine beetle had infected in BC, the moose population was declining. And I thought, that's weird, because all these trees are dying, there should be lots of young growth there. What's going on with the moose? So the guy gave up and gave his presentation, and this is the North American Moose Conference, so moose biologists from all across the world are here listening. And they basically said, well, what determines where moose go is predators and road networks. And I thought, are you kidding me? A moose that has to eat like 60 pounds of food a day is going to be concerned if there's a wolf in its backyard? Mm-hmm. It made absolutely no sense to me. And of course, it flies in the face of a lot of ecological principles. So I started asking them questions. Hey, what happens after these places are salvage logged? And he said, well, the companies will come in and salvage log them. I said, do they plant them? Yeah, they'll plant them. And I said, do they spray them? And all of a sudden, next question. And I thought, what happened? So anyways, at the break, I went over to see him, and I said, what's going on? He said, I can't answer those questions. He said, the industry is paying for my research, and I'm not allowed to talk about herbicide spraying. And I said, you're at an international conference, and you're telling everybody that wolves and roads are causing moose behavior to do what they do? Mm-hmm. Are you kidding me? He said, that's the way it is. So I couldn't, and actually the paper was just published. That research paper was just published. So in 2019, this one here, and it says, female moose prioritize forage over mortality risk in harvested landscapes. So finally, when they published the paper, it did come out, because he couldn't say that it was actually food that drove what moose were doing, because of course industry's paying for the research. Well, guess what happened in New Brunswick? All of a sudden, Rod's speaking out. So now all of a sudden, there's this huge deer research project in New Brunswick, and which I think is great. The more research we can do, the better. Mm-hmm. Let's get it out there, find out what's going on, and the sooner we do, the sooner people will realize, gee, there's the deer guy actually he might have known something. So we started doing that in New Brunswick. And who's the primary funder of the research in New Brunswick? J.D. Irving. Mm-hmm. They're using Irving's chopper to take, anyways. And I thought, man, I really hope that this research, that whoever the lead researcher is, actually can hang on and give us really good information. So I went to one of these meetings. I mean, I was outspoken. They knew I was outspoken, and I contacted some of the researchers and said, listen, why would you not have me around the table? Like, I'm the number one critic. I know what the deal is with deer. Why don't we sit down and actually talk about this collaboratively like we used to do years ago? So they did. They invited me to one of these meetings. And it was so interesting. At the meeting, they were saying we need to collar more deer, but we can't find them. Every deer in New Brunswick is being fed in the winter. So we want deer that aren't being fed. So then the guy from Maine said, well, we've got some deer in Maine that are not being fed, but they're all around a harvesting operation where there's lots of food available. And I said, guys, let's hold it just for a second and think about what you're talking about. You're saying that deer in the province in the wintertime, what matters most to them is food. So they're going to feeders so they can get food. And now the only other place you can find them where deer are in the wintertime is at a cut where there's what? Lots of food. I said, I keep telling you guys, it is about food. And and they were all just seemed like they were this last meeting I was invited to, but it seemed so logical to me. Like, my contention all along, when you have an animal that has a 4-chambered stomach and requires that much food every day, food has got to play a critical role in its ecology. And again, I mean, I'm not saying something out of school. This is just, I think, so straight ahead. So.
That's probably why there's so many in St. Andrews, to name a place where there are a lot.
You guys have a lot of food here.
And I guess that's sort of what I mean too when I say there's not that there isn't a lot of information, is that it's hard to find information that isn't financed by someone wholly invested in the future of Roundup, of Monsanto. So it's challenging as a journalist. I know you had put together a panel, I think it was last year or the year before. It was online. I went to Catherine Harrop, a journalist I really respect, was the moderator,
yes.
Bringing in experts to talk about glyphosate. But how do you source information? Where are the best places to look in your mind?
Well, again, so for my career, what I did, I was a wildlife biologist. But we wrote a lot of papers. I've published 6 or 7 papers now, and on different things that we were, about over the years. I'd like to get some time. I've got a paper I'd like to get published right now, but I'm having a hard time finding the time to get it done. So what we would have to do before we wrote something is go back through and find out all the published research on it. So, and of course there was the Natural Resources Canada Library. We had a DNR library up until about 15 years ago. So I had access through the journals to find a lot of this research papers. And again, the whole question is, what can you trust? Because you're right, as we found out, even some of the papers that were published in the forestry magazines that were saying how great glyphosate was, a lot of those were funded by Monsanto. So, and then of course the big debate I had with Lautenschlager on CBC was all over his published research that I spent a lot of time reading. So when we actually had the debate, I knew his research inside and out, and how it's termed selective sharing. And what it is, the tobacco industry perfected it back, 30 years ago, because all of a sudden the research was coming out that cigarette smoke caused cancer. So the whole intent of what they were doing was just to cause you to doubt. And I'm not sure how many people realize that, but so all of a sudden now they would say, well, is that really what the research said? And that's all they had to say, just cause a little bit of doubt. So people would say, oh no, the research says, no, well, somebody else, we're doubtful about that. So then all of a sudden the people go, gee, well, is it good or is it not good? But if it causes them to stop and think, to hesitate, all of a sudden it'll change their mind. So that selective sharing, it's been used for years, very, very successfully by people, by big business, to keep the money flowing in. And actually it's almost identical, the same thing that's happened here, And as soon as I spoke out, the first thing that came out of Irving was Rod Cumberland's unprofessional. Well, I've been professional for 30 years. Why all of a sudden am I unprofessional for sharing the science and the research and the data that I have? Well, because it goes against your narrative, is why all of a sudden Rod's unprofessional. So, and of course we got a big kick out of that, and I just kept right on. And I would say, let's have a debate. Let's have a public debate. It doesn't matter if your science is so good, bring it to the table. Let's sit down and discuss it. But no one ever does. So, it's that whole, and again, if you can control the narrative, if you have enough money to control what's out there and what's in the media, and another great spot is the actually I tried to get on the Forest Info site today, and that's of course a site that was developed because of me, or because they were trying to counter what Rod was saying. So industry and DNR all got together and they formed a new website, Forest Info. And if you go on there and read the stuff, and actually of course my big concern is deer, so I went on the site, went right down to the deer stuff, and started reading what they were saying about deer. And I could not believe professionals in this province wrote that. And they cite it, and if you look at it, they cite a lot of different published research papers. But of course, because I was a deer guy, I knew that stuff inside and out. So when I started looking at the papers, I thought, well, that paper there, they actually researched moose. And this paper here, it says that food does matter in the wintertime, but they were using all those papers to say that there's no effect on, glyphosate has no effect on deer. And I thought, you can't even, you're citing that incorrectly. And it's all right there on the website, although when I went to find it today to share it with you, I see the site's down, so I'm not sure what's going on with the site. But anything like that, even that, and I pigeonholed Mike Holland and said, I want to know who wrote this online, because I said, we can go through every one of these papers and I will tell you what they all say, because they in no way support the statement that you're making here that says that glyphosate doesn't have a problem, an issue with deer in the winter. But of course, we've never had that debate either. So anyhow, it's, yeah, and again, I don't really have an axe to grind other than, if you say I'm unprofessional and my data is unfactual, well then that's not true. It's simply not true. And I just want to have I think we should, in a province like this, have the opportunity to debate that, and it never happens. So
we are open at CHCO to hosting if there is a debate. We can set the stage for it, awesome. No problem. So I'll just put that out into the universe. Can you tell me a little bit about, now the court case was supposed to start April, your court case for wrongful dismissal. It's been moved to August. The judge contracted COVID-19, so we've got 4 more months to wait now. Can you tell me what you hope to get out of it?
Yeah, we were surprised. I mean, obviously, there was another right to information done, and there was more documents obtained that don't look very positive for them. And CBC did an article on it, and all of a sudden, that article hit I think on Sunday morning, the article came out, and then by noon, we had a call that the starting date of the trial was going to be moved from Monday at 9:30 to Monday at 1:30. And then a little bit later, it went from Monday noon to Wednesday morning. And then by Monday at noon, we were called and told that it was canceled. So, my lawyer flew in from Ottawa, and, we had a good time to get together and go over some stuff, but then we had to fly back. And so, yeah, so now that it's put off, I mean, obviously it's going to cost us, more money. And, I guess it's the other thing, you wonder how, Rod must have deep pockets, to be tackling these turkeys, and that's not the case at all. We could get into because again, I'm an open book. I have nothing to hide. But we've actually, thank the good Lord, we've been able to make our bills. Like, we've always lived very frugally. We raised 4 kids on a farm, milked a cow, the whole 9 yards. So we didn't have anything in our savings. We lived like everybody else. We lived paycheck to paycheck. So when I was fired, I was actually like, what are we going to do? Well, I kept making axe handles and cutting trees, and we realized that we said, if we can just shrink that down to, $500 a week, we can get by, so we've thankfully done it, so, and people, there's been a lot of generous people. My boss went to bat right off, Jerry Redmond, he started a fund for our court case, and actually it's paid for everything to this point. So, I mean, I'm totally, in debt and grateful to the people that have supported us.
On that note, Jerry was dismissed after that.
Oh,
too,
yeah.
Yes?
As soon as Jerry stood up and said, "Rod's a great instructor. This is foolishness," yeah, he was canned the next day. Which, again, you got to wonder, how smart are those moves? But yeah, that I think that speaks volumes in itself. So.
Well, we'll have to have you back again. I know it's still a few months away, but I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation today, and I think that there's a lot more to be talked about. So thanks for being here.
We've just scraped the surface, really.
My guest today has been wildlife biologist Rod Cumberland. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.